Hello and welcome to Why Postliberalism Failed. My name is James Patterson. With me is Thomas Howe. This is episode 14, and today is September 27, 2024. And today we will be talking about the political, cultural, and social thought of Venerable Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen. For those of you who know me, you'll know that Sheen is a person of great inspiration. If you look over my right shoulder, you'll see my slight collection on these two shelves of Sheen stuff. I received some free copies from Clooney, reprints of his books, and that I was supposed to write about. And I got a little overwhelmed, unfortunately, so I haven't ever been able to do that. But they are a great reintroduction to Sheen's work that was less popular than what he's known for among most Catholic circles today, namely his television program, Life is Worth Living. But before I continue on this, how are you doing, Dr. Howe?
Yeah. James, it's Howe's.
Howe's?
Yeah, it's okay. I get it all the time, but it's Howe's.
No, I have you in my phone wrong then. I looked into the phone and was mortified that I was saying it wrong.
You showed it's an overcorrection.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, you're good. It's Howe's. You were right.
Are you going to take this out?
No, that's okay.
Oh no, we're going to keep the embarrassment going. Yeah. So we had a first attempt at this, and my internet failed. So we're doing a second one, and I saw in my phone that I thought I had called you by the wrong name. I called you by the right name.
No, it's okay. I've done that before too, where I overcorrect. It's okay. Don't worry about it. I'm not offended.
I should mention that Thomas and I actually know each other.
Yeah.
This is not. It's. I don't know. It sounds like I just met you. It's like, how do you say your name? You know.
No, it's okay. I'm not offended. Don't worry. I'm doing well. I got over COVID and just really busy in the middle of semester. But yeah, you got that email from somebody who was asking if we'd start having a little bit more positive podcast episodes because we have so many things critiquing post-liberalism. I think the thing from our standpoint we have in the last couple, Claire Piano, and you said Paul Dehart too. Those were more positive episodes. One misunderstanding about our project is we do. We have a chapter on Catholic Republicanism in our book, and in my manuscript that I'm working on, most of it's just presenting an alternative to post-liberalism. And I guess part of the confusion with some of the debates we've had with people online, though, I just wanted to say this quick before you go on and do our positive episode about Bishop Sheen, is people say, oh, you defend liberalism. They say, oh, you're opposed to post-liberalism or liberalism, so you defend liberalism. And they operate then on the assumption that we're like Rawlsians or something, right? Like that, or that they have a certain assumption about what liberalism means. Whereas you and I are like, well, what depends. What do you mean by liberalism, right? Liberalism, it's kind of a ambiguous term, right? It can mean a million different things. So do we defend the American experiment? Absolutely. And that's really where we're pushing back against post-liberals, because post-liberals, they're opposed to the American experiment, right? They're opposed to modern constitutionalism. They're opposed to an emphasis on protection of civic rights, as opposed to a more strong government that can get more things done and is more unified in its approach. So yeah, we're opposed to post-liberalism, but we're cautious saying that we support liberalism, because liberalism can also mean, a lot of things. Wouldn't you say that's right, James?
Yeah, the trouble with that line that we get from people about us being liberals is that it falls into a fallacy of false choice, or sometimes called the black-white fallacy, which is that there's really only two options. And the way that some post-liberals try to cover their tracks on this is they describe people who take our positions as right liberals.
Mm-hmm.
And then you ask them what that means, and they say they won't tell you. But by asking that question, you've confirmed the accusation.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just dumb. It's just dumb game playing. I've never considered myself a liberal of any kind. There's a type of liberalism that often a certain kind of conservative will invoke, and that's classical liberalism. This is more the approach um, to thought that you get from the Scottish Enlightenment, a
Mm-hmm.
strong emphasis on things like emergent order,
Mm-hmm.
where we don't need to design institutions that produce an end, but rather institutions that allow for individuals to choose their own ends,
Mm-hmm.
and that the outcome of these institutions that provide greater liberty will produce necessarily better outcomes because they're freely chosen. And then that sounds like we're approaching a a position that you and I like, but I've always considered myself a little R Republican,
Mm-hmm.
because the issue I've always had with a classical liberal approach is that it places too much faith in institutional design
Mm-hmm.
to produce beneficial outcomes, and to me it diminishes the role of duty,
Mm-hmm.
which isn't very good. And But I don't have any problems with people taking more classical liberal approaches. It's just not for me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's right. And so, like, when I get accused, or when you get accused, or when people accuse critics of being liberals or standing up for liberalism, normally it's because we're not post liberals.
Yeah.
That's it. And it's like,
Yeah.
no, man, you're not listening to me.
Yeah.
You're looking for loyalty, which is a very weak place to begin if you're going to take these ideas seriously.
Yeah. And I guess for me too, probably a little closer to classical liberal, but certainly a more conservative one. Uh, like more like Tocqueville or James Madison, I think, than Milton Friedman. Although I do believe in a market economy, or I think a market economy is a good thing and all that. Um, yeah, no, but in my book, instead of emphasizing republicanism, I emphasize constitutional democracy, right? Because I really support that movement towards constitutional democracy that you get with the United States Constitution and all that. But yeah, no, but yeah, we're anti-post liberal, um,
Yeah.
but very I'm very cautious to call us liberals, right? So yeah, we'll try to incorporate more discussion of like our positive alternative vision. But yeah, we just wanted to start this why post liberalism failed, talking about why post liberalism failed.
It Yeah, because it did, and it always will. One of the people who understood this implicitly and also explicitly, and the things that he said was Sheen. I should mention that to my left is this little picture of him, but this little circle right here is a second class relic. Oop, there we go. From his episcopal garment. It's part of his purple. And this was given to me by a graduate student here at Ave Maria a few years ago, and I am very grateful for that. And so I keep it in my office, and so literally on the shelf right here, so he's watching me. You know, this if we have any Protestants listening, they have now stopped. That's too weird. But yeah, so Sheen as a figure is often remembered for Life is Worth Living, an Emmy award-winning television program from the 1950s, which offered a kind of popular, soft-faced Catholicism. At least this is how it's often described. This very kind, winsome, middle-class, bourgeois Catholicism that was easy to follow. That's often how it's
Mhm.
treated. There's the book "Amusing Ourselves to Death," in which Sheen is thought of this way. Um, oh, who wrote Protestant, Catholic, and Jew? Um,
Oh,
anyway, yeah, I've forgotten his name. I'll look it up while I'm talking. Or could you look it up?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, he doesn't, I don't think, mention Sheen by name, but he sort of complains about this problem of mid 20th century religion domesticating itself to sort of middle class popular culture, very mid brow way of thinking. Did you find it?
Is it Will Herberg?
Yeah, Will Herbert. That's right.
Okay.
It's been a while since I've had to do that work, but this is like what my first book, Religion in the Public Square, Sheen King Falwell, was about. And so the thing about Sheen is that he's really misunderstood because he's looked through the lens of his television show. And the fact is that before Sheen had a television show in the 1950s, he had been a very active priest for about like almost 30 years. And during that time, he wasn't doing this kind of more popular televised version of Catholicism. He did a very serious work, and the version that you see on television is meant to be as broadly appealing to people as possible. Although, if you watch actual episodes rather than read descriptions of them, you'll discover that he's like reading from Russian novelists and reading from Plato and Aristotle, or he's memorized them. So he's repeating memorized passages from major literary texts. So often this sort of depiction of Sheen is really just a meme that's been repeated. And as a result of things like YouTube, Sheen has kind of gained a cult following among younger people who were certainly not alive during the original run of his television series, but have watched him on YouTube. And in fact, one of the miracles that is supposed to mark the cause for his beatification, which is currently on pause, we won't we won't talk about that stuff, is actually from a person who learned of Sheen by finding his videos on YouTube. So I wrote for First Things a few years ago an article called "Taking Sheen Seriously," and that's sort of the summary of it. But Sheen is a very serious man. He attended St. Viator College, then got his canon law degree, and another degree. I think is it STS? Is that what they're called?
Oh, STD. Like
Yeah,
yeah.
at Catholic University of America. He was sponsored to go to Catholic University of Louvain, as we call it now. It was just called University of Louvain then. And there he was studying in the 1900s. So this was in the thick of the neo-Thomist moment that they were having in that part of the world. And he was accepted into something called the agrégé, which is a kind of advanced doctorate that was for very select people, and wrote a dissertation that was given a grade that you only learn of at the event where you've passed. And if you did a terrible job, you drank water at this dinner. If you did an okay job, you drank beer. If you did a fine job, you drink wine, and in very rare exceptional cases, you drink champagne. And as Sheen tells the story, the champagne was particularly sweet that night. So he, absolutely crushed this this task. The dissertations later published as a book called what's it called? God and Intelligence. He befriends while he's in England. He befriends G.K. Chesterton, who writes the introduction. And he's offered automatically, as a result of his accomplishments at Louvain, a job there to be a faculty member. But a part of the conditions of him going to Louvain was that he would return to Catholic and teach there. CUA rather. So after a sojourn in England, teaching at a very small parish, it's part of where he met Chesterton. He returns to CUA and begins being a professor there, where he publishes academic articles and books. So this man was a serious academic scholar, writing books, writing reviews of books, writing articles, doing the kind of thing that you would expect an early 20th century professional theologian and priest to do. And it wasn't until the really nasty 1928 election, in which the first Catholic nominee for the presidency, Al Smith, runs as the Democratic candidate as a Catholic and a wet. He was opposed to prohibition, and the tumult that a Catholic running for office creates is insane. I mean, in 1928, of course, the Klan is still very much a force, and while they're known primarily for being anti-black, which of course they are, they were also definitively anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish, and so the idea of a Catholic presidential candidate was absolutely horrendous to them. And there were a lot of other mainline Protestants very opposed to this sort of thing. And they fired away at a Catholic candidate who lost. Smith loses, and many Catholic leaders at the time understand that if they're going to have any kind of cultural acceptance in the United States, then they need to find a way to accomplish it through new media. And so Sheen was part of these radio priests that get on the air to explain who the Catholic people are, what the Catholic faith is, and how it fits in with America in a way that isn't very dangerous. And, it's funny that he's on the air around the same time as Charles Coughlin, and they go in very different directions.
And remind the audience who Charles Coughlin is again.
Oh, I'm sorry. I felt like I've been talking for too long. Charles Coughlin, or Father Charles Coughlin, is a Canadian priest who originally was in the Basilian Order, and eventually leaves to go to Detroit, Michigan, to start a shrine at the Little Flower and engage in sort of radio preaching, defending the Catholic Church. And in the early years, in the 1920s, he's mostly just sort of defending catechism and explaining Catholic social teaching. And a big part of Coughlin's way of thinking about Catholicism was informed by sort of Leonine labor teaching, right? So he's very into the idea of a Catholicism for the working class, especially to immunize them from appeals to communism. Unfortunately, Coughlin is a bit tinged. He's a bit touched, and this is a familiar thing now, where what happens is that as he becomes more successful, he figures out what's making him successful, and he drills down on those things. And the things that were making him successful were some of these more incendiary comments. And he was sort of like on the fringe of anti-Semitism, like approaching it. But what kept him kind of anchored was that he was a big advocate of FDR and the New Deal when FDR was running for president in 1932. But after FDR wins, he essentially expects there to be some kind of special treatment from FDR, and FDR, who does not like Catholics, is not interested, and especially because of the fringy things that Coughlin said. And so Coughlin swings wildly against FDR and begins embracing full-on like Judeo-Masonic conspiracy thinking, and eventually becomes so unhinged that he essentially has unregistered foreign agents from the Nazi Party writing for him in his magazines that are called Social Justice. He starts a party called the Christian Front, which is more or less a fascist party. And he's not taken off the air until a few months after the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, because he accuses the Jews of being responsible for that, which is amazing. Just, that's how deranged a person can get with these things. But the idea that the Jews are behind the Emperor of Japan is really an original conspiracy theory. And it is a striking contrast to Sheen, who during the same time has absolutely nothing negative to say about Jewish people, and talks about elder brothers in the faith, defends their rights and liberties as citizens of the United States, condemns the Holocaust. He's what we like to call normal. On top, that's why he should be the patron saint of normal Catholicism.
Whereas this Coughlin, right? He's like the patron for the Groypers, isn't he?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. He's
so
basically
he was like Nick Fuentes, but like a priest.
Yes, that's exactly right. And we've seen this happen with a lot of people that are Catholic apologists on media, is that they go down this road where, they start off as like reading the Secunda Thomist, whatever, what's it called, the one where he does politics in the Summa.
Oh, well,
uh,
I mean, at the end of the Prima Secunda, he talks about law and stuff like that.
yeah, Prima Secunda. I couldn't remember what it is, but
No,
it's always the book you can't find too. If you're like looking for the bound copies, that's the one that no one ever has because it's the one that everyone wants. But anyway, uh they go from reading these ideas about Aquinas um to these crazy goofy theories and speculating on the Masonic influence on Pope Francis, and you're like, no, why are you doing this? Just log off.
mm-hmm.
And that's what makes Sheen so impressive, is that he was as popular as Coughlin was.
He was as popular at the time.
Yeah, he was.
Right.
You have to remember that this is primarily a radio market, and so there's a lot of syndication.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think Coughlin would probably have the edge on Sheen a little bit, in terms of listenership, until the war is appearing to be coming. And then Coughlin is seen as essentially as an agent against American interests, and then readership really drops off with the creation of the Christian Front too.
Mm-hmm.
But Sheen is on a show called the Catholic Hour. It's not his show. Coughlin had his own show. Um, Sheen is one of many people who speaks on there, but he's one of the most popular. And so when people think about Sheen as Life is Worth Living, what's actually funny is that Life is Worth Living is sometimes just playing the hits. He
Mm-hmm.
had given those before on the radio, but of
Oh,
course, yeah, but of course, it's like, you know, 15, 20 years later, and it's not like people have these things around. Like
yeah.
today, we have like digital copies that we can call up relatively quickly. So he could do it again, and a good part of his audience isn't going to remember it.
Mm.
So it, Sheen is the master of making the most out of material. Who give a radio address, publish it as an essay in the newspaper, wait 10 years, give it as a Life is Worth Living talk, put it in the transcripts of the book, and next thing you know, you got four out of one.
Mm-hmm.
Academics should be so lucky today.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Oh, sorry, I got this fruit fly flying around here. Um, okay, so yeah, so Sheen's doing this radio show before it, like what in his TV show starts in the 1950s, right?
Starts at 51. Radio show
51.
starts in 28,
So he
and he
really was
leaves.
like Bishop Barron back then, like using all the newest platforms and stuff.
Yeah, and Bishop Barron has been very forthright about the fact that Sheen was an inspiration for him.
Mm-hmm.
And Sheen, being part of the Catholic Hour put on by the National Council of Catholic Men um, in 1928 means that he's kind of at the cutting edge of mass media. I mean, by 1928, radios are beginning to become a major part of the new media culture, the sort of analog vacuum tube sort of culture, in which there would be broadcasts around the same time. This starts creating a kind of mass culture. People are all listening to the same thing around the same time. And the idea is that the Catholic Church needs to participate in this, by presenting itself and defending its positions. And Sheen was tasked with doing that along with others. And it's something he did for a good 10 years. I don't know when he left the Catholic Hour off the top of my head. I think in 1946.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole time he was on the Catholic Hour, he was still actually writing serious books. So like Religion Without God and The Philosophy of Science are two major contributions he makes to those fields.
Oh, wow.
They're back here from the Clooney versions. I don't have the original prints of those.
You now one thing that's sort of a blank space in my understanding of Fulton Sheen is, I've watched his show before and I've sort of got a sense for his vibe. He definitely seemed like a very normal bishop, and he was very like centered, and he was holy. He was a good person. Um, What kind of relationship did he have, like in the 1940s and 50s, with these figures that are like, I don't know, like the some of the um, uh, new theology figures like de Lubac and all of those people, or people like Jacques Maritain and Yves Simon, who are also not new theology people, but they're very, very much like normal
Yeah.
people adjusting to the real situation at the time. Um, or maybe or John Courtney Murray. Like what's his relationship to those type of figures?
So a frustrating feature of Sheen is that he destroyed his papers.
Hmm.
And so it's very difficult to do that kind of work where he might be corresponding with them or corresponding about them. And so we just don't know. The way that we do have him writing reviews, and he reviews one of Maritain's books on philosophy, and he likes it, although he does say it's good for new students, new people, more not as advanced, not as useful for advanced people, but I think that was actually the purpose of the book. So
Hmm.
he's very supportive of Maritain in this review. And the thing about Sheen is that he's a personalist, and he makes this very clear in the way that he describes what he calls Americanism.
Hmm.
It's one of these things where if you pay attention to things that he says, like he talks about the primacy of the spiritual,
Hmm.
very clearly we know where he's after, right? Like he
Hmm.
is definitely part of this way of thinking.
Hmm.
And This is a pretty incredible feat for him because here's the Mercier Prize winning neo-Thomist, and he is not following the Garrigou-Lagrange line.
Hmm.
Garrigou Lagrange was a Dominican priest who was what they call the bulldog of the Vatican,
Or
uh,
yeah, he called them the monster of Thomism,
the
I think.
monster of Thomism. That's what it
Yeah.
is. Who was so strict in his adherence to this sort of European traditionalism that when Maritain decided that Vichy France was no good, he said that he was committing Garrigou Lagrange said he was committing a moral sin in a letter to him by supporting de Gaulle. And somehow, like Sheen, despite being immersed in this very traditionalist neo-Thomism, doesn't really take to that politics, instead being much more affected by personalism. And from what I've gathered, this is really scholarship that I would have to do,
Hmm.
and I think I could do. There's definitely a nouvelle theology to him, and the reason why I think this happens is because he is American,
Hmm.
and works through American institutions first, like St. Viator College, but especially CUA, where one of his professors was Monsignor John Ryan, also known as Right Reverend New Deal, who was another one of these labor priests, like we talked about with Dawn,
Hmm.
who was a big FDR supporter. Now, Sheen didn't like FDR, but he did learn a tremendous amount from John Ryan, who was attempting to articulate a kind of ground up, or sort of like not top down sort of reactionary or fascist approach, but from a
Hmm.
bottom up sort of popular approach, but not popular as a popular front, but instead as a kind of Republican
Hmm.
way of thinking. And so this kind of inoculates him from the more extreme politics that can come out of some of the people at Louvain.
Hmm. Oh, that's really interesting. I kind of got that, at least from what I watched in this show, that he always sort of could see both sides of a perspective very well. He was very objective. So he didn't tend to encourage revolutionary thought. He tried to get the workers and their employers to get along with each other and to understand each other's perspective.
Yeah,
So
there's a
that,
great book called Freedom Under God, in which he tries to account for how that will work. It sounds implausible today, but part of the reason for that is that what Sheen's assuming is that bosses and labor live in the same place.
hmm.
So it sounds a little naive today that that Jeff Bezos would go to an Amazon factory and talk to people for something that was not a photo opportunity.
Hmm.
There's actually a really lovely reprint of some of his early economic thinking from one of his Catholic Hour programs called Justice and Charity. This is put on by the Chesterton publications group, or I think it's called something like that. They're distributists, so they're a little, a little odd, right? I think they smoke church warden pipes, and I don't know, wandered the heath, but that's a really great scene there. And of course, he was friends with Chesterton and admired at least some of the thought of Hilaire Belloc. And so Sheen is also, oddly enough, he's Nouvelle Theologie. He's also like a distributist, and he's also an advocate for American constitutional republicanism. So it's quite a mix.
Yeah, I never even know what I actually have to admit that I've tried to respond to distributivism in the past, but it's actually really difficult because they don't necessarily commit to any one arrangement or anything. So it's like I don't know if I disagree with you. You guys gotta say what sort of arrangement you support.
Yeah, I've got Alex Salter's book on it.
Yeah.
And I need to review it, but I haven't because I've been writing this book instead.
Yeah, actually, I know Claire, our previous guest, Clara Piano. She, if you look at her Law and Liberty page, she did a review of it.
Oh, really? I don't know if I can say anything.
Yeah. No, Alex is a smart guy, so it's probably good. I've glanced at it. I've looked it up for like citations and stuff, and
yeah,
to consult with it. But I'll probably leave distributivism alone in the chapter in our book. I'm more focused on corporatism because there's more.
We've got enough
more of an actual concrete claim that they're trying to make.
Yeah. We've made enough people mad. We don't
Yeah,
need to,
no kidding. Yeah.
Especially because the distributists, probably on the political side, probably agree with us.
At least about like constitutional democracy and stuff like that.
Yeah, personally, I don't think we're going to recreate Hobbiton. This is sort of I always have like the idea of Lord of the Rings hobbits whenever I think of distributism. Like we're all going to have second breakfast. We just need the government to. Anyway, we just said we're not going to do this.
No.
And I haven't read Alex's book yet.
We coexist with you. We're not teasing you. Okay.
That's right.
We like Fulton Sheen, who apparently was one of you.
Yeah, it kind of was. Yeah.
So Fulton Sheen, back to Fulton Sheen. So we know that he has a friendly relationship with Jewish people. He's very sophisticated in his thinking on these things. He's orthodox, but he's open to the new theology as a way of reforming Catholic theology to bring it back to its roots. He at that time he must have participated in the Second Vatican Council then as a bishop.
He did.
And do you know anything about his experience there? Or
so people would often expect to find Sheen somewhere in the mix for Dignitatis Humanae, right? Because he does so much work in the evangelization around this kind of subject, but that's not where you find him. He is a very active participant in the council's discussion about what to do with missions. And the reason for this is that he was actually the chair of the propagation of the faith, and so he was
propaganda fide.
Yeah, that's right. And so as director of the organization for the church, he actually was supposed to be taking stock of how we should engage in evangelization abroad. And what's funny is that, he had a reputation even in the 1960s as being pretty austere. He is, militantly anti-communist and very orthodox on all kinds of social issues. And so there was always this thing because, so many of, sort of these clerico-fascist groups and Franco after the war and Salazar, they sort of tried to gain legitimacy by being anti-communist. The idea was that Sheen's anti-communism was the same thing, but he had been an anti-communist his whole life and was charged with being one by Pope Pius XI. I joke in my book, my first book, that Sheen always found an opportunity to condemn communism, except perhaps at the weddings that he officiated. But you never know. It depends on the person. But
funerals too? Probably not.
Yeah, the funerals. Depends on who died.
Yeah. Well, we pray for this commie.
Yeah. Haywood Braun, a friend of his who he converted, or actually reverted. I think
Mhm.
he was Catholic, but he was basically a pinko. He wasn't quite commie.
Mhm.
He sort of reverts to Catholicism. But he dies young, sort of tragically, and so Sheen probably condemned communism at his funeral on his instruction, Haywood Braun's instruction. But so in the 1960s, what you get from Sheen is actually a fair amount of insistence that the missions, especially the religious orders in missionary territory, are too European. And
Mm.
he thinks that part of the limitation to missionary success is the imposition of European approaches on native cultures, and that those cultures needed to have their own interpretation of religious life that fits better in with the rhythms of their own living situation,
Mhm.
and that this was how it was done in the early church.
That's right.
And so it's rather remarkable that he's a lib on the missions.
Well, I
He's
mean,
like,
that's like,
don't
yeah,
make all these kids
essentially,
wear habits. What's that?
that's an old debate. It goes way back. Like, because weren't the Jesuits a lot more like that in their missionary work, whereas the Dominicans were more hardcore about it?
That's right.
Yeah.
So that's my understanding as well. Although it sounds like you might know more about this than me, but
Well,
you
I
know,
do know that there's some claim that the Dominicans damaged evangelization to the East and China and stuff for because of their insistence on the Jesuits were allowing like honoring your ancestors because they interpret it not as worship, but as like a sort of just a way of that religiously honoring your ancestors.
yeah, filial piety. There's nothing
Yeah,
wrong with
yeah,
that.
but the what I was told was the Dominicans interpreted it like they're worshiping their ancestors and they condemned it, and that the Chinese culture just couldn't accept that, and that really hurt evangelization. Now that's I don't know. I heard that secondhand. I'm not sure, but that's the way the story was told to me. So.
Yeah, and Sheen is definitely of the former perspective and what he has to say there. So the way that I think about it is he would have and certainly have approved of the use of the sari
Mm.
in Saint Teresa Calcutta's mission.
Mm-hmm.
And would have, he thinks that it would make for a more authentic expression of Catholicism there. Now he's not some kind of like multi-culty, ridiculous type, where he wants to essentially create a kind of pantheistic version
Yeah,
of Catholicism,
yeah. So he's not
Pachamama style. you
yeah,
know
not like a syncretist, or he's not like a Unitarian or a
yeah,
liberal, even
not
a
at all.
progressive. What do you call it? I don't know what to call it. The far left wing Catholic, not anything. He's just being realistic to like culture and acculturation.
Yeah, what is it that saves more souls? Is it
Mm-hmm.
telling everyone in outside the mission that they're stupid pagans, uh,
Mm-hmm.
or finding ways to recover what's true about what's in their lives and baptize it? The latter had always been the approach of the church, but often the kind of austerity of these missionary groups, especially given that many of them were coming from a Europe that was fighting over this sort of stuff, meant that they often harmed their own mission in a way that you described happened in China.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's the extent to which he participates. And it's unusual that he actually has, from what I've been able to find, he has very little said about Dignitate Humanae. But again, there's a lot to do here, and no one works on Sheen. There's a wonderful book called America's Bishop I have over here by Thomas Reeves and
Mm-hmm.
Kathleen Riley. Pray for her. Last I heard, she's not well. Um, uh, but there's only a handful of people doing this kind of work. I think there's a guy named Farney who wrote a really great book on Sheen, and another radio priest who was a Missouri Synod. I just sort of off the top of my head can't remember, but I reviewed that book. But
So
there's not a lot of work on him, so these are all open questions.
so you said that there's two things I want to make sure we talk about. One
Hmm.
is this issue of Americanism Americanism, which because all my trad friends, if I say anything good about America, they say like, "Oh, Americanism, right?" Yeah, no. But anyways, but God loves them.
Yeah.
But the second thing is then going into like his patriotism, that his view of America, how he felt like what he thought about America and experiment, and if it was ultimately a good thing for the world and all of that.
So let's start with Americanism. This is the title of the chapter for Religion in the Public Square. Sheen's political foundation for the United States was a religious foundation. And religious foundations are a type in the work that the field that I work in, American political development. At least I used to. Now apparently I work in Catholic theology, which I didn't anticipate. But in American political development, there's a political scientist by the name of James W. Caesar. He was my advisor at the University of Virginia, and he had written a book called Nature and History in American Political Development. And in it, he talks about nature and history as foundational ideas. They're essentially the idea past which there can be no discussion. And so you accept from the beginning some kind of historical narrative or some kind of concept of natural development, whether we possess like rights by nature or something like that, and that these form the basis for discussion on constitution, on law, and so these are essentially framing devices. And he mentions religion, but sort of dodges on it. And this is partly because I think Caesar is not terribly interested in religion. So when I wrote this book as a dissertation, I decided to talk about religion. But because it's such a broad topic, I stuck with 20th century religious thinkers and how they were able to deploy religious foundations in their public ministry. And for Sheen, it was Americanism. And the funny thing about Americanism is that it has two definitions at the time Sheen uses it. The first is in contrast to Catholicism. So there's a huge nativist opposition to Catholic Church and to Catholic Americans. And they would always talk about Romanism versus Americanism. So if you look at the guy who developed Morse code, Samuel Morse, also wrote a book called Foreign Conspiracy. And, you know, if you take everything about Judeo-Masons and replace it with Catholicism, you've got yourself the Protestant version of that conspiracy theory. He genuinely believed the Habsburgs were trying to claim the American West. It was wild. Another one by Lyman Beecher is called Plea for the West. And they would always talk about the foreignness of Rome. So one of the reasons why we're called Roman Catholics is because of the emphasis on being foreign. We are not from America. And so instead of being called Catholic, you're called Roman Catholic. And the idea of these Americanists in this case is that they're nativists, that Protestantism is essential to the character of the country, and to the extent we introduce these foreign influences, they'll undermine them and subvert Republican government for the interest of the foreign prince in Rome. So that was one definition of Americanism. And the other, of course, is the one trad friends are probably talking about, which comes from Testum Benevolentiae Nostrae, an 1899 letter written by Pope Leo XIII to the American bishops, sort of nominally to the cardinal, who I keep wanting to say is Keene, but that was his friend, Bishop Keene. Anyway, the cardinal in Baltimore, who I should remember but don't. So I remember Keene, Ireland, and then the third guy, and he was the most important one. So in Testum, what you get is a condemnation of Americanism. So what is Americanism in this context? It's not America. It's not the Constitution. It's not elections. It's not. Americanism refers to a series of false propositions, the most significant of which is that active virtues are superior to passive ones. And the active here meaning like, participation in political life versus contemplation in a monastery. That would be a passive virtue. Now, where did all this come from? Well, it happens to come from our good friends in France, the reactionaries, who are going to eventually also be anti-Dreyfusards and members of Action Francais. So what happens in the 1880s is that Archbishop John Ireland of St. Paul, Minnesota, has to go to the Vatican to gain approval for something called the Farragut Plan, which was this attempt to create state-subsidized Catholic schools in his diocese. And I won't get into the details of the arrangement, but there's some concern about it running afoul of what the Vatican wants. So he goes there. It basically says to Pope Leo the 13th, "This is the best we're going to get." And Leo the 13th knows exactly nothing about the United States. He doesn't know how any of it works. He is more caught up in the problems the Vatican faces as a prisoner in Italy and all of the problems of European national conflict. America is a world away and makes no sense. So he has a very hard time conceiving of what's going on in America. So Ireland has to lay it out for him. And then on his way back, Ireland goes to France because he spoke French. He had been trained in France. He was something of like a Lacordaire, Montalembert sort of like education, right? So what would be called a liberal Catholic.
Catholic liberal.
A Catholic liberal. That's right. I can't remember how Father Ronheimer wanted it. But when he goes to France, he kind of throws some bombs. He says that that Catholics should not only support a republic because the Pope told them, but that the Republican government is the better version, and that the problem with the church in France is that it places way too much emphasis on these old medieval mendicant approaches to engaging in public life long after the world has changed. And this infuriates the French. There were French reactionaries and refractory sort of like types. And then out comes this book that had been translated into French by Father Felix Klein on Isaac Hecker, servant of God, Isaac Hecker, the founder of the Paulists, and is an interesting person because, like Orestes Bronson, he was a convert from some pretty wild and woolly versions of Protestantism. He becomes a Paulist priest, and the thing about the Paulists is that they don't have vestments; they wear plain clothes, and the idea here was to find ways of establishing a priestly order that would fit in more with America. And he was very well liked in America. He was a source of great inspiration for a lot of Catholics. And so the book did very well in the United States. And so they were hoping to sell it in France. And Ireland writes the introduction. And the introduction talks about the importance of active virtues as well as passive virtues. And this is a moment where it's seized on by reactionaries who say that this is he's saying that we no longer need passive virtues. And so there's this man who writes something called Isaac Hecker, Is He a Saint? There are all of these reactionary newspapers that are constantly causing problems. Felix Klein is a priest. He's getting into trouble. And there's rumblings in the Vatican that there might be some kind of adjudication on the question, because remember, Catholic France is a mess. There's the Dreyfus affair. There's frustrations with the left in the Third Republic. So the last thing they needed was Ireland coming in and making things worse. Ireland, the person, not the country, which was not yet a country, but should have been. But anyway, the story goes that Leo the 13th didn't want to weigh in, but essentially people in his court were really gunning for it, and so Leo the 13th essentially splits the baby, and he writes Testem Benevolentiae Nostrae and condemns Americanism as a hypothetical. So if you read what Leo the 13th said, he describes Americanism, which is essentially an outline of the book Isaac Hecker, Is He a Saint? It's just the charges made against Americanism. And it's addressed to the American clergy, but no one is named a heresiarch. No one is personally condemned. No books are put in the index. Instead, the general tone is, if anyone believes this, stop. And the real message to the American clergy was stay out of France. And they did. They stayed out of France. The only extent to which we've ever seen a kind of from Leo the 13th on this question about American Constitution is that he loves it. He thinks it's great. He thinks Washington is awesome. He just wants the United States to be confessionally Catholic. And that's actually written in Longique Oceani, which comes out before Testum, a few years before. And to me, that just points to how, again, Leo the 13th has no idea how America works.
Yeah. He just likes that. He probably likes that, he can pick whatever bishops he wants there and they don't have to stop him. And
no,
like, oh, this is great.
American state has, like, it's not like, it's not like the Spanish king who's constantly nominating the Habsburg veto. Everything goes great in America. We're the only one who gets out of the way.
Yeah. Gosh.
So he says that he wants things to be confessionally Catholic, and I think Longique is it 1891? It's something like in the 1890s, and we are like fresh off of the Blaine amendments. All right, like it's like you have like Ulysses S. Grant and Blaine and the National Liberal League and all of these different vehemently anti-Catholic efforts to prevent public funding for Catholic institutions. And Leo the 13th is so little clued into what's going on in the late 19th century that he's like, oh, just add this little bit at the end. He's essentially saying, why don't you, instantiate the nightmare conditions for all the anti-Catholics, right? No idea. He's essentially fueling the fire against the American clergy who can't say anything publicly about why this is a good idea.
Yeah, so they were very much isolated from the American culture. Like they just did not know what was going on at all on the inside.
Yeah, and that's because America's weird. It's especially if you are accustomed, Leo the 13th was quite an old man, lived a very long time, had a very long papacy, just grew up in an entirely different world from what America was like. And for so many of these popes, America as a republic is looked at through the lens of Republican France. And so there's often a suspicion. Now, Leo the 13th wasn't one of these people. He obviously liked the United States a lot. Especially compared to some of the reactionaries in France. But the trads often don't know what Americanism is. And they also get it confused between these two letters that he writes. And now there is an important thing to note, which is that after Testum and the Americanism controversy, all that blows over, Leo the 13th writes a third letter to America and essentially tells them how great they are.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, and it's called In Amplissimo, and it's the closest thing that you'll get an apology out of this Pope.
Yeah.
He screwed up. And so he's like, hey, you guys are super good. Thanks for being so good. Yeah, so he knows he got played. Leo the 13th doesn't know a whole lot about America. He knows that France is a mess, and he knows that an American caused a problem. So if he needs to put out a fire in France, he will. And it turns out he got played a little bit by these French reactionaries. And trads don't know this because that's not the kind of literature that's not brought up in literature. A lot of people don't know that it happened. But I believe it was in 1901 or 1902 he writes this. There's a funny postscript to the Americanism controversy, which is that Felix Klein, who was getting absolutely sandbagged as a French priest, later receives an award from the Vatican, and he's confused about why this is, and he actually brings it up with Pius XII, and says, I was involved in the Americanism controversy. Are you sure I should be here? And Pius XII, who was not yet Pius XII, what was his name?
It's oh gosh, I'm embarrassed.
This is why we shouldn't record after being exhausted from the end of the week. You can never remember these people's names.
Pacelli.
Yeah, Cardinal Pacelli, but it was before he was Pope. Looks at him sort of like quizzically, like, American. Oh no.
Like they don't even care about it. It's like
no, they don't care about it. It's all forgotten. And because it was just one more diplomatic problem the Vatican had to deal with while being trapped inside the Kingdom of Italy.
So that's really interesting.
So when Sheen invokes Americanism, these are the things that people will think of. They'll either think of the nativist conception of Americanism as opposed to Romanism, or they'll think of the Americanism controversy. And so when Sheen uses the term, he has to know that's what he's doing.
Yeah.
And he does it anyway.
So what does he say about it then?
So I'm glad you asked. It's almost like I did do a little preparation. So the title, not the title, excuse me, that he describes true Americanism as the following. It means two things: positively, the recognition of the sovereign and alienable rights of man, and negatively, unqualified opposition to all totalitarian forms, whether they be Nazi, fascist, or communist, which deny these rights. There is irreconcilable opposition between the regimes of Russia, Germany, and Italy. Over there, the state is the source of rights. Here, man is the source of rights. Over there, freedom resides in the collectivity, in the race as in Germany, in the nation as in Italy, and in the class as in Russian. Over here, freedom resides in man. And elsewhere he says, Americanism, as understood by our founding fathers, is the political expression, and here the trads will get mad, of the Catholic doctrine concerning man. Firstly, his rights come from God and therefore cannot be taken away. Secondly, the state exists to preserve them. The recognition of the inalienable rights of the human person is Americanism, or to put it another way, an affirmation of the inherent dignity and worth of man. As a political document, the Declaration of Independence affirms what the gospel affirms as religion, the worth of man. Christ died on the cross for him, and governments are founded on account of him. He is the object of love theologically and politically, the source of rights, inalienable and sacred, because when duly protected and safeguarded, he helps in the creation of the kingdom of Caesar, which is the stepping stone to the kingdom of God.
Oh my goodness. So what he does is he basically takes the term word Americanism and redefines it in a positive light.
Precisely.
But has nothing to do with the propositions that were condemned by Leo the 13th.
Has nothing to do with it.
So that's why the trads just don't know what they're talking about when they complain about that.
Yeah, they don't. And that's because the way that trads get fed this Americanism as a critique is usually bad faith. It's conflating two different things that Leo the 13th said and exaggerating the criticism that Leo has of the United States, and treating instead the condemnation of Americanism as a condemnation of America, which Leo the 13th did not do. And here is Sheen. And when Sheen is saying these things, they're in books that have imprimaturs and nihil obstats. The guy is going through the proper channels, and no one's mad at him for saying this. He's not getting condemned. No one's writing, to the Vatican to stop this. He's actually working on behest of the Vatican that's concerned about the state of America. The anti-Catholicism after the Al Smith election, and then after that, the concern about the American situation in the Second World War. I mean, especially with Charles Coughlin being a kind of negative example of what American priests are up to.
Now, would you say that there's this tension between the American clergy and the French clergy? Does that also extend, since because of the connection, does that also extend to the Irish clergy and the French clergy?
So the situation in the United States is very interesting. So the Catholic Church has a lot of different ethnic backgrounds and as membership during this period, right? The late 19th, early 20th to the mid 20th century, where you have Italian, Polish, Czech, German, French, Cajun, Mexican, all these different kinds of Catholics, and almost the entire hierarchy is Irish.
Oh, I've heard that before.
Yeah.
Why is that?
I wish I knew. That actually sounds like a project. But the Irish are incredibly energetic about orders and securing positions originally in the 1830s. So it might be just that they were the first to get here. And as a result, were the ones best positioned to take advantage of those institutions having been here for a few generations. There's actually fights over this. There's a guy named Cahensley in the 1890s that wants to actually maybe the 1880s, a little before the Americanism controversy. This actually indirectly feeds into Americanist controversy, who wants German majority dioceses or parishes to be able to recruit directly from Germany. Rather than have to go through the appointment through these Irish Americans. And this is because the Germans don't want to Americanize, and the Irish do. And so, it's a bit of a mess. There was also Archbishop Corrigan at the same time as Ireland, and Corrigan was, just as Irish Catholic as Ireland was, but was definitely aligned with reactionaries in France. So it wasn't as common for Irish Americans to be like that. But the fact that Corrigan was and was at this very important archdiocese presented a problem for Americans. But I don't actually know about the Irish clergy themselves in Ireland. I know nothing about that.
Okay. Okay. Well, this is all very interesting. When I studied theology at Santa Croce in Rome, I had a professor there named Martin Schlag, and I think he's a professor now at St. Thomas, actually in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Wow.
And he was from Austria. And I remember, I don't know, I must have been 26 years old at the time, and him talking about the Dignitatis Humanae in the Second Vatican Council, and him just saying that this was America's greatest contribution to the church. And he said, for which we are all grateful. And this is an Austrian talking about, the American contribution to the church to Dignitatis Humanae. And I thought that was really special. And Benedict said the same thing. He said it was reflecting on the American Revolution and the American constitutional order that kind of changed the church's mind on this. That hey, this works. We can do it this way.
And you get that directly from what Sheen has to say. The argument is very simple. From what I understand, there are two powers, right? There's the temporal and the spiritual. But the origin of temporal power isn't in the divine ordination of a particular ruler. Rather, it's in the people, as they are made in the image of God. Among themselves, will decide what the common good is, and how they'll establish institutions to serve it. And so, what we find in government authority is not the direct authority of God ordaining a temporal institution, but a derivative authority from the imago Dei of those consenting to form government. And as we saw with Paul last week, Paul DeHart, when Sheen makes these arguments in religion, freedom under God and other texts, he's invoking the same kind of natural law social contract theory, and will often go off to the side and explain how bad liberalism is. Because for Sheen, liberalism is Rousseau and Mill and these sort of ungrounded, a man is the measure of all things kind of liberalism. And it's funny as he has this like anti-liberal social contract theory, which seems like it would be impossible, but of course,
and it's pro-American too.
Incredibly pro-American, because he denies that America has at its core, in the Declaration especially, a kind of atheism or indifferentism. And as I read, like the Declaration affirms in government what the church affirms in spiritual matters. So he has there are two right there in that passage, because why else would we revolt and establish a new constitution were it not for the common good? And in fact, he regularly explains that we have a common good expressed in the American Constitution. So there's just no patience for this kind of reactionary critique of America as liberal. He wants to hear nothing of it.
Now I wonder, like nowadays, because since the Second Vatican Council, and we had this sort of collapse in membership and collapse in the problem with the clergy, like not getting enough priests and religious, at least in the West, or at least in the West. It's led to this sort of reactionary response to the Second Vatican Council that we've talked about many times. But before the council, I mean, American Catholics, this sort of it probably wouldn't have been very common for these Orthodox American Catholics to side with French reactionary Catholics on this. Would it? Was it? That's a
No,
post Vatican II phenomenon, right?
yeah, Corrigan was the exception, and the reason why you did not see Americans doing that is because what you would get from Protestant apologetics about against Catholicism was they would just read papal texts out of context,
Mm-hmm.
and so they read like Mirari Vos,
Yeah.
Singulari Nos, Syllabus Errors. And they
Mm-hmm.
would say this is what they want to undo in the United States. And
Mm-hmm.
so when American Catholics had to defend themselves, they would insist, no, that's not what we want to do.
Yeah.
And then the institutions they built to defend themselves were all Republican institutions. Like there's this
Mm-hmm.
great account of Archbishop Dagger John Hughes defending himself at a meeting better than he's being accused by his Protestant interlocutors because he had been holding these meetings in the basements of St. Patrick's and debating over what approach they should take, and he kind of humiliates these people like Hiram Ketchum who are trying to get him to say all these terrible things about what his plans are for Catholic schools. Sheen was the same way. That's what I
Mm-hmm.
meant earlier about how Sheen's education at CUA inoculated him from some of the goofier
Mm-hmm.
ideological stuff that came out of some of these neo-Thomists. Like he talks about how great Garrigou Lagrange is.
Yeah.
Really,
Yeah.
really loves his work.
Jacques Maritain also loved Gary Lagrange, at least the stuff with on ethics and metaphysics. He didn't agree with him on the politics. That's the,
Yeah, and the way that Sheen always deals with those issues is he just does not bring them up. Like he's
mm-hmm.
not going to bring up Garrigou Lagrange's politics.
Yeah.
Someone forced the question on him about Coughlin decades later. This a nun writing a dissertation interviewed him when he was very old in the 1970s and asked him, and the only thing that Sheen would say was he was more concerned about things on the earth, and I was more concerned about things in the heavens.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, cutting and true. But
Mm-hmm.
by the 1970s, Sheen had learned his lesson. He kind of talked a little too much when he was famous. All of these saints always have that particular vice that's the most difficult for them.
Mm-hmm.
And Sheen's was undoubtedly pride because he was
Mm-hmm.
always the smartest man in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that he has this sort of like cratering after the 1950s and his career, with the exception of the Second Vatican Council, where he gets to do a lot of great work, is very humiliating. Right, he spends like the last 20 years of his life essentially forgotten. And there's an effort to kind of bring him back by, of all people, William F. Buckley, on Firing Line, and Sheen had tried to restart Life is Worth Living a couple times, but the 60s and 70s were not did not have audiences that were as interested in talking about Dostoevsky.
Mm-hmm.
They're more interested in the Beatles and Led Zeppelin and All in the Family.
Yeah, what that is just really sad. As far as like the way he was treated within the by other bishops, right? And wasn't he? I mean, he never had his own diocese, right? He was always an auxiliary bishop. Isn't that right?
He was a bishop of Rochester for 2.5 years,
Oh, 2.5 years.
and he was terrible.
Okay.
He was just terrible. Sheen was used to being he was very autocratic in the way that he operated his sort of media,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's fine. He's the talent, right?
Yeah.
But when he was bishop, he was now a servant. There's a shepherd,
Yeah.
and not a strength. And
Mm-hmm.
really, the other reason why he didn't do great at Rochester was that he was fired upwards.
Mm-hmm.
His sponsor for the longest time had been Cardinal. What's his name? From New York. Oh my gosh. I'm so bad at this now. What happened to me? I used to be able to rattle off Sheen facts in my sleep, and I've been writing this book for so long I've forgotten. But yeah, he had a falling out with his cardinal, and in New York, and he was fired from being an auxiliary bishop there. I don't believe he was too happy about being taken to Rochester because he had been accustomed to living in New York. So now he's in upstate New York in a frozen tundra. And so I think he wasn't even at his best, and this wasn't an area where he would really flourish. And so he retires, and from being an active bishop, but he lives like another, you know, 15 years. He retires like in the 60s, I forget. And he lives for another 15 years. He makes Quo Vadis America and the Fulton Sheen show, and no one likes them. Part of the reason for this is that he's actually quite old. And so he doesn't have the same vigor that he did on Life is Worth Living. But he also had nothing new to say. He'd kind of lost touch with where American was. And so he really that stage of his life was over, and that was tough for him to accept. So he just lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in New York, and occasionally Buckley would drag him out and make him do his show. I do recommend watching his interview with Sheen, which is on YouTube, because Sheen's clearly lost a step. He's not he kind of forgets things. I know what it's like because I've forgotten the name of these 5 people during this this conversation. But the thing with the interview is that there's still a little bit of that old spark left, and he talks about some things that people don't realize Sheen did, like he condemned the Vietnam War, and which Buckley could just simply not believe. Because Sheen had spent much of his life being an anti-communist. Now here he is supporting communism, but the reason is because it violated the just war theory. So he explains what just war theory is, and his signature style. But what's funny is at the end he gets a question about the Second Vatican Council, and there's someone who's like, "We miss the traditional mass, and we don't like what's going on in the church anymore." So that has been an issue from the beginning.
Yeah.
And his answer, which I will not give you here, you have to go watch it after you finish listening to this podcast, is dynamite.
Oh, okay. I have to go watch it then. Yeah, no, there's clearly.
Cardinal Spellman. It was Cardinal Spellman.
Yeah, clearly everybody was unhappy with what happened right after the council, and I still haven't fully figured out what caused it, because nothing in the council writings or anything, justified it.
Yeah, and Sheen, from what we understand, actually didn't like the Second Vatican Council much either in terms of the change to the mass.
Oh,
and I think
but even if you look at the document for that, it doesn't really justify what they did with it.
What they did. Yeah. So like, this is the thing about the Second Vatican Council, is I think it would actually be considerably less controversial if they'd left the mass alone. I don't care. I'll go to either. I know.
Yeah, I'm good with either. Yeah.
Yeah.
I probably would have preferred a Latin mass done in 1964 by a priest who had done it his whole life than like somebody who tried to piece it together from YouTube in like 2015. You know what I mean?
Yeah, unfortunately, when we have Sunday Mass here in Ave, in Latin, it's a low Mass, which is a weird thing for a Sunday Mass to be. And I think as a result, a lot of the Latin Mass attendees think that this is what a Latin Mass is like. It's like mumbled. But the low Mass is said in like a nook for like 10 people, and it's said fast. We're supposed to have a high Mass, but we don't have the infrastructure for it. I don't think he wants, after the papal statement on this, I forget what it was called, Traditionis Costiatus, or what was it? You don't want to be throwing around no high Mass, all right? Like, there's only so much Bishop Frank can do here in the Archbishop, in the Diocese of Venice, Florida, by the way, not.
Oh yeah. Well,
I'm fine, by the way. We had a hurricane, and you haven't asked me once about how I'm doing.
You're closer to the other coast, though, right?
Well, we're towards the Gulf side, but we're kind of in the middle. We got a little bit of rain, and the wind knocked over a chair, so we will rebuild.
That is a funny. Kira sent me that meme when we had the earthquake up here in New Jersey,
and the chair's knocked over.
Yeah, the chair knocked over. It's like, we will rebuild.
Yeah,
no.
So
I've been in one hurricane when down in Orlando. That was kind of scary, but very,
It's not great. What
yeah.
was the other question about Sheen you wanted me to answer? I forgot. There was the one about Americanism.
Well, the one about his just patriotism, you kind of answered that he was a patriot, that he fully
Yeah.
affirmed, he saw it as, and that was a pretty common sentiment, but even with Catholic, Orthodox Catholics and Catholic bishops in the United States, despite the sort of discrimination they faced, they were very pro-American.
There's
Well,
there's a great episode of Life is Worth Living called The Glory of Being American.
mm,
Now, for some people, especially younger people, it will be a bit kitschy.
mm-hmm,
And but that's okay. It's the 1950s television, so there's going to be kitsch. And it's a great introduction to Sheen on patriotism, because what you're getting there is actually a summary of the work that he did in a book called Declaration of Dependence, which is actually a compilation of things that he had said about this sort of thing. And what he describes in that is that for Americans to be patriotic requires them to understand that the Declaration of Independence is an independence from totalitarianism, but a declaration of dependence on God, because that
mm-hmm,
is the choice you have to make.
mm-hmm,
Um, Either you have a God King, or you have you have Christ,
mm-hmm,
and that's why whenever there's a totalitarian state, they're usually going to try to suppress religion of Christianity, because it contains things like place your faith not in princes, and illustrates that states will often crucify the Lord rather than honor him. So um, these kinds of statements that you get are pretty incredible. But the reason why the glory of being American is so good is that it's Sheen at his best. It's like he's in his prime,
mm-hmm,
and so it's very powerful, the way that he describes the importance here. And what he uses is that as he reminds people, is that it's important that Americans honor the rights of the minority.
mm-hmm,
It's not what you'd expect. Normally, when people talk about patriotism, they talk about like this unanimity of belief,
mm-hmm,
that we all are like patriotic Americans, but Sheen doesn't believe that.
mm-hmm.
And he said that one of the glories of being American is that we honor the rights of the minority because we understand them to be equals under God.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
and that's because Sheen remembers he's in 1950s, he's in his like late 40s, early 50s. No, yeah, maybe he's in his 50s by then, and he grew up in India and Illinois,
Mm-hmm,
and experienced directly the prejudice that came from a Protestant majority. He actually had a half sister that was taken out of the home because the mother, um, who had died, had been Protestant, and the father remarried, and the woman that he remarried was Catholic. He married the second time, was Catholic, and had Peter Fulton, or John Peter Fulton John Sheen, and other members of the family. But because there was this half sister who was Protestant, the Protestant family demanded that they receive custody,
mm,
um, and it was granted. So Sheen had a very personal experience with this kind of prejudice, in addition to being a friend of Al Smith, when Al Smith was going through the bouts there. And so Sheen still harbors this memory of what it means to be a Catholic American,
mm-hmm.
and how America at its best protects his rights. And that's the same reason why Catholics don't want to do what some French Catholics are saying about tyrannizing people, because the American Catholics know better.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. That's great. Did and then I guess my last question. I guess we should wrap it up here soon here,
Oh,
but
sure, yeah. You got me
um,
on the Sheen episode. We could do this all day,
yeah,
except I'll
no,
forget
no,
some
no, yeah.
names.
But you kind of
By the way,
sound like
the cardinal from the Ireland period in Americanism was Gibbons.
Cardinal Gibbons. Okay,
Yeah.
okay, okay. So, but Sheen, let's talk about Sheen for a second. Um, one concern I have is that we it was kind of a bummer for people that because he told us that at the end of Sheen's life, last 20 years, he just kind of sat in his apartment and was a big failure. Is there anything redemptive you can say like anything that like a happy ending to that story you have when you write the movie script for Sheen?
Okay, so first of all, as a man who's prone to overstatement, it's not quite true. There are these great recordings of Sheen holding retreats. He was very sought after for doing retreats, and to the point where he did a recording of what he would say. I actually have them somewhere in my office. I don't have all. It's a booklet of audio tapes. I don't think all the tapes are in there, but most of them are. And so he was sought after. But
Mm-hmm.
what I mean is that, like, being a popular retreat leader is not the same as winning an Emmy,
Mm-hmm.
or, having personal meetings with the Pope. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so for Sheen, this is quite a decline. I highly recommend, if you had never seen this photograph, just look for the photograph of Fulton Sheen at St. Peter's when a then young Pope John Paul II comes to the United States.
Hmm.
As it turns out, Sheen had actually had some influence on Pope John Paul II, and
Cool.
the influence was felt in the way that the Poles, responded to Dignitatis Humanae. Remember, the two groups that really pushed for that. One was the American clergy, but the other was the communist oppressed Eastern European clergy,
Yeah.
uh, who knew what it was like now,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, this is what it's like to be tyrannized by um, an atheistic regime. It's not the same as when you think that you're fighting to preserve a Catholic majority. It's very different. And
Oh, that's right.
so,
Wasn't
go
there an
ahead.
Eastern European cardinal that stood in front of everyone during the debates about the Dignitatis Humanae, and he basically begged everyone to sign it because he said he explained his own experience of being oppressed.
Yeah. and, and believe me, every single one of those Americans had, like, at least one fist fight
Oh,
over this sort of stuff. So it's the Spanish, of course, that are there, the Spanish clergy, they're all, Franco acolytes, so they're going to oppose this sort of stuff, um because it's not in their interest. But so anyway, that's a different subject. We talking about
yeah.
Lejeune and Second Vatican Council's deliberation over Dignitatis Humanae. We actually kind of
Well,
already did that one.
and Journay supported Dignitatis Humanae, just so everyone knows. He was a big
Yeah,
supporter.
he was
Uh,
incarcerated specifically for that purpose.
and he was influential both on Maritain's understanding of the matter because his work in the 40s, although integralists liked that work, it actually inspired Maritain in his own work on it. And by the end of it, Journay and Maritain were in one mind about the whole thing. That
Shout out to my provost, Roger Nutt, who wrote a really awesome article, co-authored. I forget the name of his co-author. He's a graduate student here, on Journay and his support for the Second Vatican Council's
oh,
Dignitatis
I need
Humanae.
to find that. Okay,
That's
good, good.
awesome.
Yeah.
The so he the Pope comes to St. Peter's, and there's Sheen. Sheen is about 3 months away from death
Mhm.
when this happens, and the Pope seeks him out. And Sheen is very weak, so he has to be helped up. And he's so the we for maybe younger people, they remember Pope John Paul II as this kind of like hunched over man who was like had almost no hair left, would always be like blowing in the wind. But in the 70s, he was the young, vigorous anti-communist Pope. And so here he is hoisting up the old soldier, right,
Hmm.
who had defended the rights and liberties of those made in the image of God, and says to him, "You are a loyal son of the church, and you've done
Wow.
well."
I've seen
And
that picture.
and Sheen is visibly
He's
is
like he's
visibly
like
moved.
he's like in tears almost, it
Yeah,
looks
he's
like. Yeah.
basically about to start crying. And the reason for this is that Sheen has now, this is when he's a saint,
Hmm.
is that he's had these high highs and now he's in these low lows. And at the end of his life, here comes the Holy Pontiff, here comes the Holy Father, in anticipation of his death, saying, "You are my son in whom I'm well pleased."
There you go. That's that beautiful ending that I was talking about. That's how you end the movie, James. Because you're right. Yeah, there's some spiritual meaning for this like low period for him that he's got to like be formed, right?
That's exactly
And
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, that's beautiful. Thank you, James, for giving us that ending. Now that I I think somebody should probably make a movie about him then, huh? You just gave him an
Let's
ending.
go. Yeah.
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 That'd be
I
great.
mean, imagine having to cast Sheen. Be
Yeah.
tough.
You could have it like one of those biops, like like Dewey Cox, but not
Yeah.
like Dewey Cox, but like what's the one that it was teasing, like the one on uh what's his name, the Man in Black. It's like
I forgot. I'm
what's
sorry.
sorry, the singer. He's married. The
Will Smith?
Johnny Cash. I was thinking of the
Johnny
Johnny
Cash,
Cash
the other Men in Black.
movie. Yeah, yeah.
Not the crappy 90s movie and the even crappier 2020s remake, but you mean like the iconic country music singer
Yeah,
who's
yeah.
I was struggling to understand what you were talking about
I'm
there.
so
So
sorry. It's
yeah.
Friday. I
It's
forget.
Friday.
I forget what my silverware is called, like like fork and spoon and all those things. Like, I'm at that point.
You've got long COVID. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
that's probably what it is.
We should have closed at the at that line I used, but now instead we droned on about this.
Yeah, no,
We're
I'm
so bad at this.
Oh no, it's okay. I apologize to our listeners.
No. I'm the one who can't remember any of the things I'm supposed to talk about today, so we'll be
Yeah. So,
fine.
anyways, if anyone is a screenwriter or a director or anything, I would watch a movie on Fulton Sheen.
So would I. We need to figure out who will play him. Um, Cillian Murphy.
Yeah, I could see Cillian Murphy play.
Yeah, the thing about Sheen is that he has this very particular face. These
Yeah.
deep sunk eyes that are often dark, and but he's also got like this. He's got this odd brogue, so it might actually be
Yeah.
good to get an Irishman in there who can
Yeah.
let some of the brogue out.
And then we can let Cillian Murphy convert to Catholicism in the, filming,
Oh,
which is
yeah.
probably
They do a
it
little better
happens
than
all the
Shia
time,
LaBeouf.
right? They all get into the role, and that's how Alec Guinness converted. He was playing a priest in a movie.
Yeah, and Shia LaBeouf did when wasn't he playing Padre Pio?
Oh yeah, that's right.
So yeah, I mean, we should. I don't know what the story is with Cillian Murphy, but Irish people today are not fans of the church,
I know.
for reasons that are a whole other episode.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, Thomas, not Thomas Howe, Thomas
House.
All right.
It's all good. Don't worry about it. Next week we think we're gonna have Matthew Wilson. He's a recent graduate. He's a former student of mine. He's a recent graduate at Princeton University. Wrote an awesome article about Charles Maurras and his
Boo, Charles Maurras, boo.
Charles Maurras and his how he's not a good model for Catholic politics today.
Nathan Bukowski, hardest hit.
Yeah, that's right. And it was just really well done. We were all proud of him. I mean, I already knew that Matthew was an outstanding writer. I'm kind of jealous that he's like 23 years old and he's a better writer than me.
I didn't really like that at 23.
Huh? No, he's outstanding. So you'll probably hear his name more than this if he's a journalist someday at the New York Times or whatever.
He crushed it.
Yeah.
It was so good.
Yeah, very good. So we're looking forward to probably having him on next week, if we can find the time to do it. So I guess, lead us away, James.
Thank you for listening to the Why Postliberalism Fail podcasts. Goodbye and God love you.
Oh, also subscribe and like and follow us on Twitter.
Yeah.
That adds up over time. My wife insists that we add that. Subscribe, like, follow us on Twitter.
No, goodbye and God love you. Thanks for ruining it.